Hello, my name is Ken Westerman. I am a film historian working with the University of Missouri at St. Louis, and I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce you to the cinematic work of cinematic auteur Alice Guy Blache. Her mother was born in Paris. Her mother was from Paris, and her mother married a South American bookseller. So her mother and her father raised four children in Santiago, Chile. In 1872, there was a smallpox epidemic in Chile, and they decided it would be safer for the family to move back to Paris. While they were in Paris, Alice was conceived and born. Alice was born in 1873. Her parents returned to Chile shortly after because they had business in Chile, and Alice was left with her grandmother. Her grandmother was in Switzerland, and at the age of 6, Alice was put in a convent for education on the French side of the French and Swiss border. Alice's father died in 1891. Her mother returned to Paris to live with Alice, and Alice had to get a job to support them both. She became a stenographer. In March of 1894, she began working with the Comptoir Général de la Photographie, which was a photographics equipment manufacturer, and it was struggling. It was on financial bad terms, and it was bought out by a man named Leon Gaumont. Gaumont was a businessman who wanted to reinvent the company a little bit. And one of his investors, just anecdotally, was Gustave Eiffel. Alice was assigned to be Gaumont's secretary. Now, Gaumont was intrigued by the works of the Lumiere brothers. The Lumiere brothers had invented a box, the Lumiere cinematography. And this was a single box that they could put film in, and they could shoot a movie, process the film, and then reverse engineer the box as a projector. So they could film and project from the same unit. Uh, um, Gaumont wanted to mass produce their camera projector system. He wound up being an equipment manufacturer for the motion picture business. Now, films of the Lumiere brothers were pretty simple. People leaving work, people having dinner with their kids, train enters station, kid steps on hose. These were not groundbreaking films. And Alice Guy was kind of bored with the works of the Lumiere brothers. And as Leon Gaumont's secretary, she had his ear. So she suggested there was more potential to the medium than was being explored. So she asked Gaumont if he would let her try something, and he agreed to let her give it a shot. She came up with a film called La Fille à Choux. Now, I have no idea. I don't speak French, so I'm going to call it The Cabbage Fairy. This was produced in 1896. It looks something like that. Now, this is not a tremendously exciting film, but it does introduce story. It has a story. It's based on a popular myth in Europe that girls are born in girls are born in roses and boys are born in cabbage patches. And the Europeans understood the myth that this was based on, so this became a very popular film in Europe. Now, the film itself was limited to 1 minute, and the reason it was limited to 1 minute was because they hadn't figured out at that point in cinema how to keep film from breaking under tension. So the solution was to make films short. They were typically less than 90 seconds long. It was about a year later that the Latham brothers invented the Latham loop, which was a tension rod that would compensate for that. So for the first year that Gaumont was in business, they couldn't make films over a minute. About a year later, the technology came along to make them longer. Alice refined the Cabbage Patch several times. She remade that film several times, refining her process along the way. Every time the technology got a little better, she made another version of the Cabbage Patch. Gaumont was impressed with Alice, and he made her the head of production. So it was Alice's job to come up with all these little films to keep content in Gaumont's library. And in I don't know exactly what year, but Alice began working in color. And this was a process of hand coloring film. It was somebody would go through frame by frame and paint the color in. Now this particular photo is not a frame that was colored. This was a promotional still from the remake of the Cabbage Fairy in 1900. But if you want to see an example of what her color looked like, this is an old film from 1900 that was hand colored for Gaumont. So this is George Méliès. Now I'm not going to go into George Méliès too much, but George Méliès was probably the most prominent film director of the 1900s, and he made a classic called The Trip to the Moon. The reason I mention him, well, first of all, I don't know that Alice and Georges Méliès were ever friends or ever met, but it seems inconceivable that they would both be working in Paris at the same time and not know of each other. So they probably cross paths. Now, I don't know who colored Alice's films, but I do know that Georges Méliès's films were colored by Elizabeth and Berthe Tullier. This was a mother-daughter combination. And the way they got into the business was they were coloring slides for magic lanterns. Magic lanterns were basically a slide projector. It had a piece of glass. They'd hand color something on it, put it in the projector, and it would project on the wall. Now, the reason this came into existence was because of the carbon arc lamp, which is right here. This came into prominence in 1864. Carbon arc lamp had two posts. A little spark would go between them. It was surrounded in a little globe of gases that would glow when the spark was going off, and it got very bright. This was the equivalent of a neon bulb or a fluorescent tube today. So the carbon arc lamp made this possible, and this could be driven with a battery. This became a popular thing for aristocracies in Europe to have a magic lantern so their kids could show things off to their friends. But Elizabeth and Berthe Tullier were the ones who colored Georges Méliès's films. And a frame sample is that. That's one of the frames that the two of them would have colored for Georges Méliès. Now, just as an anecdote, Elizabeth Tullier died in 1907, and that corresponds pretty much with when the demand for hand coloring films stopped. Now, it wasn't so much her death that made it stop. It was more that film production was becoming a business, and people weren't interested in investing the time and energy and the money into hand coloring film. So the demand just fell off by about 1907. Only coincidentally, that was the time when she died. In 1902, Leon Gaumont invented something new called the chronophone. The chronophone was a recording device that would record audio onto a wax cylinder and play it in sync with the projector. And the result was sound on film. You add color, and you really got something. So to demonstrate this, he had Alice produce what he called phonoscenes. And this is a sample of a phonoscene that Alice directed. This was this one's 1904, I believe. Now, Alice made approximately 100, or I don't know exact number. She made hundreds of these little promotional videos. And it was kind of a staple of the Gaumont industry to make these little produced sound videos. These were effectively music videos of the era. But they illustrated sound and color and Gaumont's system very well. Here's a picture of Gaumont Studios. And there's a couple of things that I find intriguing about this picture. First, so this is a backdrop behind the performers. If you look above, there is 4 additional backdrops, so they can simply fly in or out, whichever backdrop they want for their scene. Over here On this side, this is the chronophone that's recording the audio. This appears to be Alice. I'm assuming that's Alice Guy there. I'm not positive. Over here is the camera. Now, these two triangles here, I'm guessing, I'm not positive, but I'm guessing these are giant mirrors that are reflecting the light back onto the performers. And then what I find most intriguing in this photograph is these two devices right here on the side. These appear to be lighting arrays. This photograph was taken in 1904. The reason this intrigues me is because Los Angeles did not get electricity until 1917. This photo was taken in 1904. Hollywood wasn't using electricity before 1920, so this is at least 15 years before Hollywood had electricity. So Gaumont was way ahead of his time. He was 2 decades ahead of his time on this production stuff. And Alice Guy was his muse, so to speak. In 1905, Gaumont paired Alice Guy with Herbert Blache, and he sent the two to Germany to teach Germans how to add color and sound to their cinema. If you can guess by the name, the two fell in love. In 1906, Alice released what would become her masterpiece. This is a film called La Vie du Christ, The Birth, the Life, and the Death of Christ in 1906. This film featured lavish sets. Let me just jump ahead. This film featured lavish sets, 300 extras, camera trickery, color elements, and sound added to the miraculous moments in the story. It ran 33 minutes, and this film was an international blockbuster. I'll scroll ahead a little bit so you can see a little more of the cinematography. You can see the stagecraft going on, and it certainly is more than we would assume we would be seeing at that particular point in time. Now, if I scroll ahead, just see a little more. This film, by the way, film historians still look at it today and still think it's an impressive piece of work. It would have been shown with potentially a person in the audience narrating the story. I have looked online. I cannot find a version that has the color elements or the original sound elements online, but she did release it with color and sound. Now, at the time of the film's premiere, the film was made in 1906. It premiered in January of 1907. At the time of the film's premiere, Alice was engaged to Herbert Blache, and their marriage was going to prove problematic to Gaumont. The reason being, in France, it was not acceptable for a married woman to have a career. So Gaumont made a proposal. He suggested that if Herbert and Alice wanted to move to America, they could run his North American operations. And the hope was that Alice would teach the Americans how to do color and sound if she did it. Alice and Herbert accepted. They moved to America. However, they were newlyweds moving to America, and they ran into 3 immediate problems. The first was Gaumont's facility in North America was in Cincinnati. At that point in history, the cinematic hub of North America was New York and New Jersey. So they were in the wrong place. Second was they had to acclimate to being Americans. They had to figure out what it means to be an American. And the third thing was Alice got pregnant. So she was pregnant with her daughter Simone, and she took about a 3-year hiatus from filmmaking. Herbert continued to work for Gaumont, made films for Gaumont, and he eventually formed his own company, but they worked beside Gaumont. They discovered that the Americans had no desire for color or sound. So that part of the ambition went by the wayside. In 1910, Alice was ready to start again. Her and her husband formed a company called the Solax Film Company in Flushing, New York. Within 2 years, they were so successful, they built the Solax studio with an investment of $100,000. And it was a state-of-the-art studio in New Jersey, in Fort Lee, New Jersey. This photograph is of the studio being built, and if you look right in the center at the bottom, that is Alice Guy, and you may be able to tell that she is pregnant. in the photo with her son. She was not going to let having a child slow her down this time. In the early 19 teens, Alice was the highest earning female entrepreneur in America. She was reportedly earning $25,000 per year when the average salary of an American was about $1,400. They had numerous write-ups. People loved the fact that she was a woman and that she was successful, and they did numerous write-ups on her in newspapers and magazines around the country. You'll see that sign there that says "Be Natural." That was a sign she had hanging in her studio because she didn't want actors to act. So "Be Natural" was her slogan. In 1912, Alice produced the 10-minute film "A Fool and His Money," featuring an all-African-American cast. Now, I don't want to suggest that this was controversial. This was an anomaly. But at this particular point in history, no producers in America were casting all African-American cast. This was unusual. For Alice, it wasn't, because she had been producing dozens of hundreds, if not hundreds, of films in France with multiracial casts. So this was not strange to her. But it was an unusual thing in America to have an all African-American cast in a production. Well, by the mid-19 teens, West Coast production began to overtake East Coast production. And Solax was in New Jersey, and they were having trouble keeping up. So Herbert Blache decided he would move to Hollywood and start making films on the West Coast. Alice followed Herbert, but unfortunately she contracted the Spanish flu and she nearly died. When she got to the West Coast, she was having trouble connecting with material, and she couldn't quite make films in the Hollywood way that worked for her. And so, and then the other problem became that Herbert had an affair in 1918 with a starlet, and by 1919 the two had separated. The Solax studio caught fire in December of 1919, and that was pretty much the end of Alice Guy's ambitions. The two separated in 1919 and were divorced by 1922. Herbert made films in Hollywood until 1929. In 1951, Herbert Blache was accused of being a communist during the McCarthy era, and he died in 1953. Alice directed her last film in 1919. After her studio burned down, she declared bankruptcy, sold all of Solax's assets, and returned to France in 1922. She never made another film. In the 1930s, Leon Gaumont wrote his biography, but he omitted any reference to Alice. Alice complained, and Gaumont considered that and re-edited his biography to include references to Alice's contributions. Unfortunately, there was never a second printing of his biography, so Alice appeared to be omitted from history. Well, she didn't wish to be omitted, so she began writing her own memoirs. Unfortunately, when they were finished and ready to be published, Germany occupied France, and no one was going to publish a book by a French author during German occupation. So it appeared she was destined to be lost to history. In 1953, she was awarded the Légion d'honneur, which is the highest civilian honor a person in France can receive. This is the equivalent of a person being knighted or damed in France. Now, in Alice's case, she would be damed, but men are knighted, women are damed. So this would have been the equivalent of Alice being damed if she had been from England. But she received the Légion d'honneur, and there's a wonderful little video somewhere on YouTube I stumbled on that has her grandchildren talking about how their grandmother always wore this little lapel. They had no idea what it was, and she wore it proudly wherever she went, and they had no idea that it was a Légion d'honneur. Alice Guy returned to the U.S. in 1964 to live with her daughter Simone. She died in a nursing home in New Jersey in 1968. I have this little reference. This is from Alfred Hitchcock's memoir, and he claims that his inspirations were Georges Méliès, D.W. Griffith, and Alice Guy. It was also Alice Guy was also noted for being an inspiration to Sergei Eisenstein from Russia. Alice's daughter Simone found her mother's memoirs and had them published in French in 1976, and then Simone translated them to English in 1986. Over her career, Alice Guy made over 1,500 films. 22 of those films would be regarded as feature-length productions. Most of her work has been lost to time. She introduced story, stagecraft, sound, and color 2 decades before Hollywood ever got to it. She launched the career of dozens, if not hundreds, of future French filmmakers, and she set the tone for French cinema for the next 2 decades. Alice Guy's story is the tale of a giant and a pioneer in cinema who was lost to history. Thank you very much.